All right, in this explainer, we're really digging into the bedrock of Christian belief. We're going to find out how the foundational doctrines of a global religion were literally hammered out in the fire of debate.
You know, the theologian Karl Barth called this a voyage of discovery, and for good reason. We're not talking about dusty old books here. We're talking about the epic, and I mean epic, debates at the very beginning that literally defined what Christianity is.
It really boils down to this simple question, but the answer? Well, it's profoundly complex. The thing is, there wasn't some master plan, No simple instruction book was handed down. The reality was way more, well, human. The truth is, these core beliefs were forged over 600 years of intense debate. This was not some quiet committee meeting, not at all. It was a massive, empire-wide, soul-searching argument that ended up defining an entire faith. So our story really kicks off in this fascinating, kind of turbulent era that scholars call the patristic period. This is where the real nitty-gritty work of defining the faith got started. Yeah, patristic, it sounds a little academic, right? But it just comes from the Latin word pater, which means father. So this was the era of the church fathers. And these guys were the first great thinkers whose intellectual showdowns would go on to shape Christian doctrine for the next 2,000 years. Now, it's really important to remember that these ideas didn't just pop up out of thin air. They grew in very specific places, in these intellectual hotspots that basically became the epicenters for all this new theological thought. So as Christianity started spreading out from Palestine all across the massive Roman Empire, certain cities just lit up. They became these vibrant hubs for debate. And what's so crucial to get is that the faith wasn't this single monolithic thing. Nope, it developed all these distinct regional flavors and even competing schools of thought.
So, for example, you had Alexandria in Egypt. Their theology was super philosophical, really heavily influenced by Plato. But then way up in Antioch and Cappadocia, you had a completely different style emerging. And over in Western North Africa, well, the powerhouse city of Carthage became this major center for Latin-speaking theologians.
And seeing this, looking at the ruins of Carthage, it really makes it feel real, doesn't it? This wasn't just some abstract philosophy happening in an ivory tower. In these very streets, intellectual giants like Tertullian and Augustine of Hippo lived, they argued, and they ended up shaping the entire future of Western thought. Okay, so let's meet some of these architects, right? These are the key figures whose ideas really became the building blocks for Christian theology. First up, you've got Justin Martyr. He was known as an apologist, which basically just means he was a defender of the faith. And his brilliant move? He argued that the best parts of Greek philosophy were actually pointing towards Christian truth all along. He was building a bridge between two very different worlds. Then you have Irenaeus of Lyons. Now, if Justin was building bridges to the outside world, Irenaeus was building walls to protect the faith from the inside. He fought fiercely against what he saw as heresies, trying to keep Christianity totally anchored to the original teachings of the apostles. Over in Carthage, you had Tertullian, and he was a fiery lawyer who became a theologian. He took a much harder line than Justin. For him, there was absolutely no need for Greek philosophy. Everything you could possibly need, he argued, was right there in the scriptures, period. Okay, so fast forward about a century, and the debates just get more and more intense. With this guy, Athanasius of Alexandria, he was a theological titan. His entire life was basically consumed by one huge, universe-altering question: who exactly was Jesus Christ? And the answer he came up with would define the faith for centuries to come. And finally, the giant Augustine of Hippo. You could argue he's the single most influential Christian thinker outside of the New Testament itself. What Augustine did was incredible. He took all these different threads of theology that came before him, from scripture, from philosophy, from all the debates of his day, and he wove them together into this coherent, powerful vision that has pretty much dominated Western thought ever since. All right, so we've met the people and we've seen the places. Now let's dive into the debates themselves. Because here's the thing, Christian doctrine wasn't born in some quiet, polite consensus. It was forged in the heat of some serious conflict. First off, we have to remember the context. You've got to picture this. For the first few hundred years, just being a Christian was dangerous. It was a persecuted, often secret religion. So arguing about theology wasn't some fun academic exercise. It could literally be a matter of life and death. And then, everything changed. Just like that. In the early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine converts, and suddenly Christianity goes from being illegal to being the favored religion of the entire empire. These theological debates, they moved out of the catacombs and straight into the public square. They actually became matters of imperial policy. And with all this newfound freedom, well, it was like an explosion of questions. Really fundamental questions that just had to be settled. Like, what books actually belong in the Bible? Who exactly is Jesus Christ? What's the deal with the Trinity? How are we saved? What even is the church? These weren't minor details. This was the absolute heart of the faith. Of all these debates, the Arian controversy was probably the most critical. It was a total showdown. On one side, you had a priest named Arius. He argued that Jesus was the supreme creature, but not fully God. On the other side, Athanasius fired right back. He said, "No way! If Jesus isn't fully God, then salvation is impossible, and that means Christians who worship him are committing idolatry." I mean, the very nature of salvation was on the line. And at the exact same time, another huge debate was raging. Which books should even count as scripture? It's easy to forget this, but this process of fixing the canon took centuries of arguing. The first time we see the list of the 27 New Testament books we know today isn't until a letter from Athanasius way in the year 367. And even then, it took church councils later on to formally make it official. So you've got all this chaos, right? Persecution, these intense debates, division. But out of all of it, a new kind of coherence started to emerge. The church realized it had to find a way to make clear, definitive statements about what it believed. And a pretty clear process began to develop. Here's how it would go. First, a controversial question would pop up, challenging a core belief. Then, debates would just erupt all across the empire. Finally, leaders, usually bishops, would get together at a big meeting, a council, like the famous Council of Nicaea in 325. Their one job was to hammer out a formal statement of faith, a creed, that would define Orthodox belief for the whole church. And this is exactly why this whole period matters so much. These weren't just abstract arguments for academics. The outcomes of these debates directly shaped the fate for billions of people today, which, it leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. If just one of these ancient arguments had ended differently, how different might our world and maybe even our own personal beliefs be today?